So today we're not actually going to graph. We're going to talk about how we figure out stuff from the graphs and from the equations. And once we can do that, then we'll start actually graphing tomorrow. So here's a parent function for sine and cosine. And it says, much like what we discovered last week, notice that the cosine function is a horizontal translation of the sine function, right? If I took this sine function right here and I just shifted it to the left, pi halves, then it would look like this. Okay, so cosine can be written as a sine function every time. So it says any transformation of a sine function is called a sinusoid. Therefore, sine and cosine functions are called sinusoidal functions. Okay, so when you have sine waves or sound waves or whatever, they're all sine functions. We could write them as cosine functions, but we don't call anything cosinusoidal. Like that just doesn't make sense. All right, so another category that these fit into are periodic functions. So functions that repeat, because obviously this just keeps repeating, at regular intervals are called periodic functions. So these are sinusoidal functions and they're periodic functions. Those aren't one and the same. Like you can be periodic and not be sinusoidal, and we'll look at some of those too. Just trying to give you some vocabulary here. We're going to fill in some definitions and we'll come back up here and label some stuff on these graphs. We've talked about period, amplitude, and frequency, but I'm going to give you the actual definitions of them. So your period, it is the length of one cycle. And it can start at any point on the graph. Most of the time, we started at 0 because it's easier to count that way, but we don't have to start it at 0, and I'll show you that once we get there. All right, so your amplitude. Your amplitude is half the distance between max and min values. That's the official definition of it, but there is an easier way to look at it. But that's like what you would see as a definition there. And then your frequency is just the number of cycles in 2 pi units. So let's go back up to these pictures here. So we've got the period is the length of one cycle before it repeats. So I could start here, say, all right, well, this is one cycle, then it starts to repeat, and I can see that that length is 2 pi. I could even start here and say, all right, I'm going to go here to here, and that length right there is 2 pi. That's totally fine. But again, a lot of times if we can start at 0, we do, because it'll just be easier to figure out. So one cycle would look like this, from here to here, which means from here to here would be the length of the period. The amplitude, it's half the distance between the max and the min values, but we can also just look at it as the distance from the midline to a max or min value. That way, you don't have to count and divide by 2. This right here would be the amplitude. So for our cosine, even though we know it's a cosine graph because it tells us, I could start here where it looks like a sine graph and look at my one cycle. But again, would be easier to count if I actually started here at 0, because then I could see that my cycle ends here at 2 pi. So from here to here is the period. And then this would be my amplitude. And it doesn't matter where you count the amplitude from, as long as, whether you go up or down, that amplitude's still 1. It wouldn't be -1 because it went down, because it's the absolute value of that A. Everybody good with that? Any questions? All right. Let's talk about midline. So, when you shift the graph vertically, it'll create a new horizontal axis. So much like when we graph things that had asymptotes, if we graph the asymptotes first, then we could use the asymptotes as our new axes, and it made graphing everything easier. Same kind of thing with the midline, right? So when we create this new horizontal axis, it's called the midline. Basically just moving where the x-axis is. This is the reference line to which the graph oscillates. So the oscillating is the bouncing up and down. The equation of the midline is always y equals d. It's an equation of a line, so you don't just give a number. You can see here when you just have the sine parent function, your midline is right there at y equals 0. If my graph is sine of x plus 4, all that happens is the entire thing shifts up 4. So my new midline right here is y equals 4. And I can see from the midline to the maximum that my amplitude is 1. Right? That's why having midline in there helps. So you always want to sketch it in, because it'll help you figure things out. All right, so to look at these transformations, the one that's missing from here right now is C. We're not going to be shifting left or right yet until we can figure everything else out. Doesn't mean that we can't, we're just not at this point. So our amplitude from here, that's your absolute value of A, right? Period and frequency are both related. They're related to each other. The one that you get directly from the equation is the frequency. That's the absolute value of B. The period, which is what you're going to need to figure out, you take 2 pi and divide it by the absolute value of B. If I have the period and I need the frequency, another way to look at this is that the absolute value of B equals 2 pi divided by the period. So remembering how those are related is going to be very important. Your vertical shift is just like what it's always been, D, and then the midline is y equals whatever D is. Any questions at this point? All right. So we're going to use equations and come up with this stuff, and then have graphs and come up with this stuff. So it says identify the amplitude, frequency, period, and midline of each function. All right, so on number 1, right here, what is my amplitude? 1. It's the absolute value of A. There's not an A there, so it's a 1. Okay, the frequency I can get directly from the equation. What's the frequency? 4. So it's the absolute value of B. To find the period is always going to be 2 pi divided by the frequency. So I have 2 pi over 4. What does that become? Pi halves. And then my midline, it's a line, so it's y equals what? 2. All right, so let's talk about the frequency and the period. Your B is 4, right? At x lies. So we know if we have a B, that means it's going to be a horizontal compression because the number is bigger than 1, right? So for my parent function, the period is 2 pi. Once I take 2 pi and divide it by 4, my period is only pi halves, which means that one cycle is going to have to happen a whole lot quicker than it did when I had 2 pi units. Make sense? It's taking your graph and it squished it, and you get your horizontal compression still. Okay, we good? All right, let's look at number 2. What is my amplitude here? Seven halves. Is that a stretch or a compression? Stretch, yes. What's my frequency? 1. Good, because there's no B, so it's got to be 1. Which means the period is what? 2 pi, yeah, because the period is always 2 pi divided by whatever your frequency is, so it's just 2 pi. And then my midline would be y equals -3. Good. Questions? All right, you do number 3. All right, what do we think the amplitude is? -5 or +5? +5. It's always the absolute value. What is that negative going to do? What does the negative always do? Reflect. And would I reflect in the x or y axis with that negative? Reflect in the x axis. Very good. All right, so what's my frequency here? My frequency. Frequency is b. Yeah, it's 1/3. Okay. Which means the period is what? 6 pi. Good. Because your period is equal to 2 pi divided by 1/3, which is the same thing as 2 pi divided by 3/1. You have to know how to handle fractions. Then your midline is y equals what? 0. Very good. Any questions on that? All right, you do number 4. What's my amplitude? 2. Good. My frequency? 4/3, right? Those both come straight from the equation. And then my period? 3 pi halves. Good. And, I know for some of you, you're going to be able to do the trig, but it's that 4th grade math that's going to get you. And honestly, I don't know how to help you with that anymore if you still can't figure out fractions. But it is 2 pi divided by 4/3, which is the same as 2 pi times 3/4, and you figure it out from there. My midline is y equals what? 5. Okay. We good? Any questions? Awesome. So let's look at it going from the graph. When we're going from the graph, there's a couple things I want to get in my graph before I worry about what's going on. I'd like to get my midline in there. So I can see that I go from 6 to 2, or from 2 to 6, either way. So my midline would be right here. So I'm going to sketch that in. It's going to help me figure things out. I also want to figure out one cycle of this. Now, these all could either be sine or cosine functions. However, we are not shifting left or right yet. So I can see when I start on the axis right here that this would actually be a cosine function. So looks like this. All right, so with all that, I got my one cycle, I got my midline in there. My amplitude, what's the amplitude going to be? Amplitude is half the distance between the max and the min values, or it's just the distance from the midline to a max or min. So have all this in here. It's 1, 2. That's it. 2. Your frequency may be something you can count from the graph, but it might also be weird to count from the graph depending on what's going on. That's how many cycles occur between 0 and 2 pi. So when I look at this, I can say, all right, I have 1, 2, that's actually 3 full cycles between 0 and 2 pi, so my frequency is 3. The period, maybe I can get that straight from the graph. It starts here and it ends here, but here is not anything that I know exactly what it is on the x-axis. So instead, I know that the period is just equal to 2 pi divided by the frequency, which is 3, so it's 2 pi thirds. then my midline would be y equals what? 4. Okay. Questions about that? Good? All right, so let's look at number 2. I want to get my, or not number 2, I'm sorry, number 6. I'm going to get my midline in there first. So I can't really read those numbers up here. I think it's from 1 to negative 3. So this is at 1, this is at negative 3, which means that my midline should be right about here. So starting at 0, that would make this a sine function. So 1 cycle would look like this. So from that, I can get that my amplitude is what? 2. My frequency, going from 0 to 2 pi, like right here to right here, that's 1 1/2. So as an improper fraction, what does that look like? 3/2. Would never put 1 1/2 and absolutely never put 1.5. The period, so I can get that from my graph as well. I start here and I end here, and it does end on something that I can actually, well, I can't read that up there, but I think y'all can read it. Does that say 4 pi thirds? Yeah, 4 pi. Or you could do 2 pi divided by 3/2. It doesn't really matter either way. But it is 4 pi. Yes. Amplitude is just the distance from the midline to the maximum point. That's 2 units. Anything else? Then what's the midline? Y equals negative 1. Very good. Questions? All right, you do number 7. All right, what is my amplitude here? 4. Okay. My frequency, how many cycles do I get between 0 and 2 pi? 1, which means the period is 2 pi. Very good. And my midline is y equals negative 2. Any questions on that? All right, do the last one. I'm sorry, one more time. How do you find the midline? It's halfway between the maximum and the minimum. All right, what do we get for the amplitude here? 3. Very good. You agree with 3? All right. So frequency, how many cycles do I get in between 0 and 2 pi? 1/2, exactly. And so that makes the period what? 4 pi. Yeah, because you'd have to divide by 1/2. So if I'm going to get half of it in 2 pi, I'm going to need another 2 pi to get the full thing in there. And then my midline is y equals 1. All right, what questions do you have? All right, so today's assignment is in Delta Math, and you're going to have some graphs where you get information and some equations where you get information like we just did. Very important that you try and get this done before tomorrow when we actually start graphing, because you're going to need all this information. Okay, we good? Awesome.